I went to a lot of cubing competitions last year. For a long time, I've averaged about 3 per year, but in 2023 alone, I went to a mind-boggling 21 of them. Obviously, I couldn't make a video about every single one, so instead, I'm going to do one big recap and tell you how I did in every single one of the almost 200 rounds that I competed in. From power outages to solar eclipses, from broken bones to grizzly bears, I'm going to tell you about all the interesting stuff that happened at competitions this year. Now, my first competition last year was a very strange one, Colorado Trifecta 2023. Basically, they held 3 rounds of 3 of the strangest events: Square 1, Clock, and Fewest Moves. Something really funny happened to me during Square 1. I made it through the first round just fine with a pretty decent average, which qualified me for the second round, but for some reason, they were still enforcing the fairly strict 35-second cutoff, which I didn't meet during my first 2 solves, so I didn't get to finish my average. I don't think I've ever seen that happen before after having qualified for a second round. In the next event, Rubiks Clock, I had a pretty long grind throughout the year to lower my personal record average under 10 seconds. I didn't make any progress in the first round with a 10.60, but then in the second round, I did successfully lower my PR average down to just 10.25. So close to sub 10. And that was barely good enough to make it to the final round. Remember, this was a very weird competition format with 3 rounds of everything, where I didn't do very good. And finally, Fewest Moves is an event where each solve is an hour-long attempt to come up with the shortest possible solution to a given scramble. Recently, I've been kind of playing it risky for a good single to beat my PR of 29, but as you can see in this case, it didn't work out. I got a couple DNFs just because I couldn't find anything good, and a 33, which is okay. The next competition was more of a traditional one, High Plains Solving 2023. The first round of 2x2 went alright, I got a pretty typical average, and the second round of 2x2 went less alright. I was probably just tired at the end of the day, but no big deal. In 3x3, I had pretty recently set a really good PR average of 13.56 seconds, but it had been a long time without any normal competition since then, so I was a little bit out of practice, and I didn't do that great in the first round. The second round went a little bit better, but still made a few mistakes, and I guess I just wasn't really feeling it this day. Skewb was another event where I had just set a PR average of 5.15 seconds, but I've been really inconsistent with Skewb, getting times anywhere from 4 to 7 seconds, or in this case, apparently a 13. The second round went a little bit better, and I got this really lucky 3-second single, not quite a PR, and that was good enough to get to the Skewb finals, where, well, I started getting 12-second times again, which, needless to say, didn't break any records. In the first round of Clock, I was on track for that sub 10 average, but then ended up just missing it with a 10.25, which actually ties my average from the last competition, which technically means it's still a PR. And then funnily enough, in the second round of Clock, I was even closer with a 10.10, so I ended up barely missing the sub 10, but still a pretty decent PR. 3x3 one-handed is an event that I find doesn't get held very often compared to other side events. In this case, it didn't go very well for me. I normally average around 25, but I got a 29 average. In 3x3 blindfolded, my first solve went alright, except I had a few flipped edges, which meant it was a DNF. My second solve, I just gave up early so that I'd have enough time in the 15-minute window to complete a third solve. It was a success, but a little slower than my normal times at almost 5 minutes. The next competition was called Happy Crew Cubing Colorado 2023, another fairly typical competition that started out with a pretty typical 3x3 average. I guess I hadn't quite gotten back into the swing of things 3x3 wise, with another mediocre average in the second round. 4x4 was another event where I had just recently got a really good PR average of 53 seconds, but it would be quite a while before I ever got another average quite that fast. 7x7 was probably the most brutal event of the year for me. I came in having never completed an official mean of 3 in competition, with my PR single being 531.21, just 1 second away from the cutoff I needed to finish my second 2 solves. And at this competition, well, it happened again. I beat my PR single by 0.05 and still missed that cutoff again by about a second. In Skewb, you can tell I was pretty dialed in at this competition with a couple of 4-second solves in the first round. My average was only dragged up by a few unlucky cases. And then in the final round, I finally managed to get my first ever sub 5 average. It was the classic scenario where you have a bad first solve, 3 really good solves, and then you have to clutch it out with shaky hands on the last solve. And the cherry on top was that this 4-second average was good enough to get me second place in the competition for a very solid podium. Oh yeah, there was also a round of Clock, but I once again managed to barely miss my goal with an average just over 10 seconds. The next competition was a really fun one, Mile High Megacomp 2023. With 229 competitors, it was the biggest competition in Colorado history by about double. I was feeling really good at the beginning of the day, and I managed to get this really good 3x3 average, my 4th best ever one in competition, just a half a second away from my PR. But by the time round 2 hit in the depths of the afternoon, I was a little bit tired, and obviously I made a few mistakes in this one. In 4x4, I also did really well, starting out with this really solid 47-second single. Unfortunately, it was just one of those rounds where you start out really dialed in and then just get slower and slower every solve, but it still ended up with a decent average. 6x6 also went fairly well, considering it was the first event of the day and I had been busy filming all morning with basically no chance to warm up, so the fact that I got anywhere near my normal times was enough of a success for for me. The first round of Skew was your fairly typical average, dragged down by a couple of bad solves. The final round of Skew was an all-around solid one, definitely PR potential if one of them had been a little bit faster. Now in Pyraminx, my PR average is 5.34 seconds, but funnily enough, that is my longest standing PR, being set way back in 2017. So frankly, getting within 1 second of that average was good enough for me at this competition. The second round of Pyraminx was a bit more typical of me, just kind of flailing around, pauses everywhere due to a severe lack of practice. But you know what? I'd rather do badly than not compete at all. And speaking of what I just said, Megaminx. This was another very brutal event for me this year because I had just set a couple of really good PRs in 2022 and then proceeded not to practice at all and just got a bunch of really bad averages. The next competition was one of my favorites of the year, Colorado Brain Freeze 2023. It was another atypical competition that held only the most mentally taxing events, so all the blind events plus fewest moves. As you can see, the first round of 3x3 blindfolded didn't go very well with a triple DNF, which means I didn't make it to the next rounds, but maybe that's a good thing because they ran behind schedule and had to finish the final round outside in the middle of winter in Colorado. There were some very distracting geese that we had to fend off. It was overall very entertaining to watch. But then in 4x4 blindfolded, I had been trying for years to get my first official success. In my first solve, I was off by just 2 centers. My second solve was a little bit worse than that. But then on my third attempt, I finally got my first ever 4-blind success in competition and my fastest ever 4-blind solve with a time of 26 minutes and 45 seconds. It was the slowest success at the entire competition, being over 3 times slower than the next person, but I could not be happier. It was actually good enough to get me 3rd place. There were also a couple attempts of multi-blind, where you get an hour to memorize and solve as many 3x3s as possible. I attempted 6 cubes each time, and I totally failed both times, only solving 2 of them, which is technically a DNF. Finally, this competition also had a single solve of fewest moves, where I again got a pretty decent result of 33 moves, which was good enough for 1st place. Moving back to another normal competition, we have Don't Be Fooled Colorado 2023, a competition that was held on April Fool's Day. 2x2 as always went fine with a nice little 5-second average. 3x3 also went pretty well. In this average, I think the nerves just caught up to me after getting a couple of really good solves to start out with, and I did even better in the second round with a couple of really good solves mixed in with some mediocre ones. That trend of mediocrity continued in 4x4, not a bad average, but not great for me either. And then 5x5 was yet another event where all year I was battling some really good PRs that I had set the year before. In this case, I came up a little bit short. 6x6 was a similar story as well, some decent times, but overshadowed by previous years where I had more time to practice. Clock was pretty sad at this competition. On my first solve, I accidentally moved all the dials down to 6 o'clock instead of 12, which meant it was a DNF, and then I secured my fate with a couple of bad solves on the next 2. The sub 10 would have to wait for another competition. 3x3 blindfolded was probably my best event of the competition. I actually forgot to bring my blindfold, but luckily I was able to borrow one from a good blind solver, and I guess his powers rubbed off on me because I got 3 pretty good successes. You can see everyone was really excited for me, but unfortunately, it was about 1 second away from a PR mean that I had set years ago. Now the next 3 competitions were also some of my favorites of the year because they were part of the Colorado Mountain Tour. Now this was actually a set of 5 competitions, 5 days in a row. I couldn't make it to the first 2, but each one was in a slightly further away city in the mountains of Colorado, the first one being in Avon, making for a fun little road trip. As you can see, the first round of 3x3 went horrible, but it's okay, the pretty view made up for it. The second round also went just as badly, but I had a pretty good excuse for being tired. I had flown across the country the night before, gotten home at 11 p.m., and then woke up at 5 the next morning, and then drove 2.5 hours across the state just to get to the competition on time. Luckily, some other events actually went pretty well that day. In the first round of 4x4, I started out with 2 extremely good times, but then I ruined all PR potential by getting some bad times to end it off with. And then by the second round of 4x4, I think the lack of sleep had caught up to me because I got over a minute in all but one of the solves. Yikes. Megaminx, as I mentioned before, was a struggle all year long. My PR average was a 126, but in this case, I got a 146. But then in square one, even though I didn't get a particularly good average, I ended up getting this really lucky PR single of 19 seconds. It could have been a lot faster if I had practiced a little more. I almost forgot one of the very easiest algorithms at the end, but you know what? I'll take a PR any day. Then I guess that first round acted as a pretty good warm-up because miraculously, I ended up with a pretty decent average in the second round, 28 seconds, just 1 second away from my PR. Then in one-handed, I knew I could pretty easily PR in both single and average, but I got some pretty underwhelming times in this first round and missed those by about a second. But then in the second round, I immediately beat my PR single by a fraction of a second on the first solve, but then I got some slower cases in the last few solves and missed my PR average also by a fraction of a second. Oh yeah, and then 3x3 blindfolded was a total failure. I managed to get not even close to solved 3 times in a row. The next day was a new competition in the Colorado Mountain Tour, this time in Glenwood Springs, and I guess I was awake and ready to go this morning because I immediately edged out my 3x3 PR average with a 13.50. Once again, it still had a lot of room for improvement with a couple of bad solves followed by 312s, but you know what? I will gladly take it. The next round of 3x3 was not too bad, but obviously not nearly as good as the first. But then in 7x7, the 530 cutoff came back to haunt me once again as I got a PR single, 530.63, just a fraction of a second away from being able to finish my mean of 3. This is one of the few events I've still never gotten an official mean in, and this fail was especially brutal because I was so nervous I was locking up like crazy. Skew went pretty bad in the first round, but I didn't care because I was pretty content with my recent PR. Somehow, Skew went even worse in the second round despite getting 2 really lucky times. I guess I should get around to practicing some of those tricky cases sometime. Although luckily, I managed to redeem myself in the final round with a pretty decent 5.55 average. The first round of Pyraminx went alright. Funnily enough, they had to redo our entire group after they used the wrong set of scrambles, but lucky for me, I actually did a lot better than I did the first time around. The second round of Pyraminx also went alright, and the final round of Pyraminx also went alright. Would you believe me if I said this was my best Megaminx average of the entire year, even though my best single of the average was actually slower than my PR average? Well, it's true, and it is pretty sad. And speaking of sad, 3x3 blindfolded has also been a bit of a struggle for me this year. I've been kind of trying to rush my solves for a good single, but most of the time that just backfires with a DNF. In this case, I got one mediocre solve with a 423. For the final competition of the tour, all the way out in Grand Junction, I started out with a pretty mediocre 2x2 average, 5.86 seconds. I really don't practice 2x2 at all, but I'm decent enough at Ortega to get 4 and 5 second averages consistently, so in the second round, I got a pretty typical 4.93. And rounding things out, it's always nice to barely squeeze into the final round of a small competition like this, where I got a 5.21, not too bad. I also got to witness the excitement and then pain of world record holder Zain Kanani when he got a +2 on his last solve, which was the only reason he failed to get the first ever sub 1 second 2x2 average. The first round of 3x3 went alright, not super fast, but very consistent. But then the second round of 3x3 went great, with a rare sub 14 average, and easily my most consistent one ever. I was super happy with this. A really good average plus a really small competition made this one of the rare times that I actually made it into the final round of 3x3, but nothing great came of it. I actually came last place in the round. In 4x4, I managed to make a sandwich of really bad solves surrounded by pretty good solves, and then I managed to do the exact same thing in the second round once again. I promise this wasn't intentional. 5x5 was slightly less of a letdown than normal, coming in about 3 seconds away from both my PR average and single. Square one happened pretty similar to last time, with the first round acting as a warm-up and getting me into the second round, where I then proceeded to fluke out a really good average. This is my second fastest one ever, less than a second away from my PR of 27.35. Then clock came around, and after so many close calls, I finally got not only my first ever sub 10 average in the first round, but then in the finals, I managed to immediately get a PR single of 853, and then proceeded to get every single time under 10 seconds to destroy my PR average with a 9.48. The next competition, Unorthodox Blocks Colorado 2023, was interesting for a bunch of reasons. For one thing, I had just broke my hand and had surgery, which you can tell from the massive scar on my hand and the fact that my pinky isn't doing anything. But it was also a strange competition where the only official event was one round of 3x3. I did pretty good considering my hand, and then the rest of the events were all unofficial, so things like Mirror Blocks, Killaminx, and Ready Cube. It was a fun change of pace, especially considering I wouldn't have done very well in the normal events. 1 week later, I was obviously still injured, but that didn't matter because it was time for US Nationals 2023, the most fun competition of the year and the biggest competition in history at the time with 1,028 competitors. So I finally had a good excuse for not practicing. As you can tell, 2x2 went fine, just like normal. 3x3 probably could have gone a little bit better, except that this was the busiest part of the busiest day of the competition, and I was in the same group as Max Park, which meant that there were hundreds of people watching me in the audience, which made me a little more nervous than normal. 4x4 was one of the more solid events at this competition. I can't complain about a 55. Skew was one of the harder events to turn with a not completely functional hand, so I think I did alright under the circumstances. Funny thing is, there are so many fast people at this competition that I never even make it to the second round, even in my fastest events, which was also the case in Pyraminx. I was caught totally off guard by the first round of Megaminx while filming, and funnily enough, I actually ended up solving pretty well by the end, but only after getting warmed up with a bunch of bad solves. In clock, I continued to add to my collection of barely above 10-second averages, and then the one event that I actually practiced a lot for, one-handed, I guess I wasn't quite warmed up and I was a little bit nervous, so I ended up getting a really bad average. Fewest moves also went okay. It was technically my highest ranking because so few people qualify for it. A 34 mean isn't great for me, but I can't complain about a successful 3 solves. Colorado Jungle Jumble 2023 was another really fun one because it took place in a little back room at the Denver Zoo. So after a mediocre round of 3x3, I could go outside and check out the grizzly bear instead. I actually got recognized by some kids who weren't even part of the competition. Pyraminx was your typical not great but not bad average. Megaminx was your typical not great and yeah, just bad average. In Clock, I DNF'd by 1 piece and then added yet again to my collection of not quite sub 10 averages. Then in 3x3 Blindfolded, I failed once, got a really slow success, and then didn't have enough time to even attempt a 3rd solve. Centennial State Cube-Off 2023 was a pretty typical little competition. We had mediocre 3x3 average number 1, mediocre 3x3 average number 2, pretty decent 4x4 average, pretty bad Scube average. We had the world's most consistent square 1 average. 25, 28, 109, all very similar. I got my 3rd ever official sub 10 clock average, definitely some good PR potential with a couple of bad solves. Then in one-handed, I was practicing a lot and very consistently averaging in the 24-second range. I ended up beating both of my PRs, but only beat the single by 0.05 and actually only tied the average, so very slight improvement. I was all ready to go and do it again for the final round, but then ended up messing some stuff up and only getting a 27. Colorado Pastacomp 2023 was a competition that included a free lunch, just like it sounds. The first round of 3x3 was whatever, but I think the most notable thing to happen was that the power went out in this dark little room for a solid few hours. Eventually they gave up and moved all the tables into the hallway where there was a bright window nearby, but apparently that didn't help my 3x3 average too much. In 4x4, I have no comment. That was a little underwhelming to say the least. In Scube, I started out my average terrible, but managed to come back at least a little bit. Then in the final round, I got a very similar single and average, and the exact same ranking of 7th place. Megaminx went slightly less bad than last time, which is to say, still pretty bad. Square 1 was the round when the power first went out. Unfortunately, I wasn't filming at the time, but it was right after my first solve. So I have to say, this is probably the first time I've ever had a 2-hour gap in between the first and second solve of an average. Finally, in 3x3 Blindfolded, I got a triple DNF. Oh well. But the funny thing is, in the previous group while I was judging, the power kept turning on and off again, along with some very quiet background music in the hallway, which I just found very funny to happen during Blindfolded of all events. Hopefully it wasn't too distracting for the competitors. The Art of the Cube Colorado 2023 was another very interesting competition for many reasons. First off, I forgot the SD card for my camera, so I quickly drove over to a Walgreens before my first event, realized it was like $30 for the cheapest possible SD card, which is a total ripoff, so I just decided to film with my phone instead. Now this 2x2 average here was not an interesting thing that happened, so we can skip right over that. Now the other interesting thing about this competition, which you might have gathered from the name, is that it was actually located at the Denver Art Museum. Definitely one of the fanciest venues for a cubing competition, and we all got free admission, so I spent my lunch looking around for pretty paintings of mountains I've climbed. This 2x2 average was also not very interesting, so we'll skip past that one as well. And the final interesting thing that happened was that this was actually on the day of the solar eclipse, which meant that the sun would be covered up 84% here in Denver. Everyone was concerned that the lighting would get really bad in the room, but turns out 16% of the sun is actually plenty good enough for cubing. Oh yeah, this final 2x2 average wasn't very interesting either, so we'll skip past that one as well. Moving on to 3x3, you can see in the first round that I started off really well, and then seemingly messed up in every way possible. And the second round was not much better, apart from a couple of decent solves. Then 4x4 somehow went even worse. This was my first average in years without getting a single solve under a minute. I got a couple decent solves in the final round of 4x4, but somehow the bad solves got even worse, which meant my average was even slower. Square 1 was square 1, what do you expect? And in 3x3 Blindfolded, despite setting the cube down pretty fast, well, the cube wasn't solved, so no PRs for me this time. Now, believe it or not, we still hadn't made it to the most exciting Colorado competition of the year yet. In fact, we were just warming up for it with Rocky Mountain Warm-Up 2023. This was a competition of many events and strict cutoffs. In fact, 3x3 was the only event with a second round, which I didn't make it into with this pretty mediocre average. In 4x4, I did pretty well though, coming back from all those terrible 1-minute averages last competition. But in 5x5, not only was I nowhere close to my PR, but I also missed the cutoff of 1 minute and 45 seconds that you needed to finish your entire average of 5. Oh well. I also missed the cutoff in 6x6, and I did so in spectacular fashion. The cutoff was 2 minutes and 50 seconds, one of the strictest I've ever seen, and I missed it by almost a full minute with 3 minutes and 45 seconds. In 7x7, I knew I was also going to miss the 4:45 cutoff, but I figured I could at least beat that 5:30 PR single for a 4th time. But alas, I was 5 seconds too slow for a PR and almost a minute over the cutoff. Another mediocre Scube average, another mediocre Pyraminx average, another blazingly consistent square 1 average, but in 3x3 Blindfolded, I managed to do pretty well by following up a couple DNFs with a 3:04, just 3 seconds away from my PR single. But I think the funniest part about this competition is that nowadays, I almost never check what events are on the schedule until the night before. So what event do I realize I'm signed up for at 6 a.m. the next morning? That's right, multi-blind. This was probably the most unprepared multi-blind solve I've ever done. I only attempted 4 cubes and only actually solved one of them. But that leads us into Rocky Mountain Championship 2023, the biggest competition in Colorado history again at 288 competitors. It was awesome to see so many local cubers in one place. I got over 50 fans to sign a cube of mine, and as usual, we can skip past this first round of 2x2. The first round of 3x3 went surprisingly decent. Definitely some PR potential if not for that last solve, but I'll take a 14 average any day. The next round of 3x3 wasn't quite as good, but still nothing to complain about. 4x4 also went surprisingly decent. Again, nothing record breaking, but I'll take a 56. But then things started going downhill with 5x5. The cutoff was a crazy strict minute and 35 seconds, but I got the numbers mixed around and got a minute 53 instead. My first 6x6 solve was actually pretty okay, but this time around the cutoff was 3 minutes, so I still didn't make it. And just to add insult to my traumatic 7x7 experiences this year, I got yet another time in the 5:30s, but this time they set the overall time limit at 5 minutes 30, which meant it was technically a DNF. The first round of Skew went alright, the second round of Skew went alright, the first round of Pyraminx went alright, the second round of Pyraminx went alright, the first round of Megaminx, well, it went somewhere, and the first round of Square One also went alright. In Clock, I collected yet another average that wasn't quite sub 10, but was pretty close. And in one-handed, I took what should have been some easy PRs and threw them away with some questionable times near the end there. 3x3 blindfolded went really well. On my second solve, I got a really good scramble, executed it really nicely, and got a PR single by about 30 seconds. 2:31. Now you may have noticed this is one of the rare competitions where they have all the WCA events and anybody's allowed to sign up for them. I tried all of them except for 5x5 blindfolded, but in 4x4 blindfolded, I didn't do that great. These were probably some of my worst 3 solves. I guess I'm just a little bit out of practice. In multi-blind though, I had what was probably my best ever attempt, with a successful 4 out of 6 cubes solved. Unfortunately though, this isn't actually a PR, because the way that scoring works is that a 2 out of 2 is actually technically better than a 4 out of 6. And finally, fewest moves didn't go that great. Funnily enough, my best solve was the first event of the first day when I couldn't find parking and came into the venue 5 minutes after the attempt had started. But despite having the full time for the next 2 solves, I couldn't find anything else as good, and on the last one I actually messed up writing it down and ran out of time, so I got a DNF average. Next competition, Pillar of Fire Colorado 2023. At this point in the year, it felt like they were having competitions almost every weekend, so even if I wasn't trying, I was getting a lot more practice in than usual. This shows not only in the first round of 2x2, where I was a fraction of a second away from a PR average, but also in the second round, where I got my first 2x2 PR average in over 4 years. Thanks a lot to some of those lucky 3s in there. The first round of 3x3 also went pretty well, but nothing special. And the second round of 3x3 was a little bit subpar. But then I seemingly ruined this 4x4 average with a 107, but then I brought it back with a pretty big PR of 52 seconds. The first round of Skew was okay, the second round of Skew was a lot better, and the third round of Skew was somehow still decent, despite one time setting down the cube confidently unsolved. This was somehow one of my better Megaminx averages of the year, despite being way slower than my PRs from 2022. But then I did pretty alright in Square One, especially considering the lack of practice, and then I finally destroyed my one-handed PR single with a nice 20-second solve, and got a nice little bump to my PR average as well, even though I think I could still get quite a bit faster. Colorado Cold Hand Showdown 2023 was a pretty underwhelming competition, except for one crucial round. As you can see in 2x2, I did decent in the first round, and decent in the second round, nothing to write home about. I really struggled in the first round of 3x3 with a 16-second average, but then in the second round, everything worked out beautifully. I got my good solve and my bad solve out of the way early, and then with the help of some lucky scrambles, I just got 12 after 12 after 12, making for, at the moment, what's basically an unbeatable 3x3 average for me at 12.51. Then I got whatever this monstrosity was in 4x4, we can skip right past that, and then, oh gosh, I didn't even make the cutoff in 5x5. We can ignore that one as well. But surely Pyraminx went okay, right? Oh, never mind. How about the second round? Oh, nope, that one's bad too. Okay, I told you there was only one good round at this comp. So that brings us to USAFA Flyby Cubing 2023, a fun little competition at a nice venue inside the US Air Force Academy outside of Colorado Springs. The first round of 3x3 went fine. The second round of 3x3 went fine. The round of 5x5 went also fine, at least I made the cutoff this time, and the round of 6x6 went pretty poorly. Again, glad to just make the cutoffs. But then in Scube, I managed to get a decent average in the first round, despite that unironic 17, and then in the next round, some very consistent times got me my second ever sub 5 average, with a 4.94, not quite a PR, but still very happy with it. And my final round was also pretty decent, coming in at a solid 9th place against some really good competition. Meanwhile in Pyraminx, I got my first sub 6 average in over a year, giving me at least a little bit of hope that maybe I can PR again someday. They were supposed to have 3 rounds of Pyraminx, but they were running so behind schedule they ended up cutting one of them off, so it ended pretty abruptly for me with this rough average in finals. Megaminx also happened, and so did Clock, where I got another barely not sub 10 average. I actually got a PR single on that first solve, which I didn't realize until over a week later. And then I rounded things out with yet another 10-second clock average. I have quite a lot of those now. My final competition of the year on December 30th was Happy Holidays Colorado 2023. I was doing pretty well in the morning with a pretty nice 14-second 3x3 average, but by the afternoon I had slowed down a little bit and only managed one decent 12-second solve at the end of the average. In 4x4 I did astonishingly well. It's not every competition I get a sub 50-second solve, much less two of them in the same round. Unfortunately, this first round average wasn't quite a PR because of those two slower times in the middle. That got me into the final round, which also started out really well with a nearly PR 46 flat single, but unfortunately the nerves caught up to me with some good but not great solves near the end there. 5x5 was a little unfortunate. In my first solve, I barely made the cutoff time written on the paper until I learned that they had actually changed it down to 145. Then the second solve was going really well. It was going to be really close to the cutoff until I messed up the parity algorithm, had to redo a bunch of edges and everything, and then ended up like 30 seconds slower than it should have been. The first round of skew went okay. The second round of skew went really good, really consistent times there except for that 9. And then the final round was certainly quite the average to end the year on. 2 decent solves, 2 terrible solves, and then 1 solve where I totally misrecognized the case and then confidently set down the cue both unsolved and misaligned. Wow. Square one also happened. I did 0 warm-up for it and did remarkably decent given the circumstances. And you guessed it, in Clock, I got one more, not quite sub 10 average to add to my collection. So those were my best solves from every one of the 189 rounds of competitions I went to last year. 2023 was an interesting year where I actually spent more time practicing in competitions compared to at home, which led to some mixed results, a lot of good PRs in some events, and a lot of failures in other events. But either way, I had a ton of fun at all 21 competitions, and there's a lot more coming up next year. Stay tuned to watch me compete in PRMinx at 1 a.m. But I hope you all enjoyed this crazy long recap and go to some fun competitions of your own this year, because that's pretty much it, and I'll see you guys next time.